Hi, welcome to another episode of Hot Takes. Way back in the midst of ancient time, about 2016, Herr Sturgeon said that the attainment gap in Scotland was too big and she was determined to close it. Now, for those who are unaware, the attainment gap means the difference in educational outcome between the richest children, those from the wealthiest backgrounds, and those from the poorest backgrounds. And of course, there is this vast differential between the two. And let's face it, that's not going to be surprising. Now, obviously, there are going to be exceptions on both sides, but as a general rule of thumb, those from the wealthier backgrounds, they'll have more resources, more teaching resources, more training resources at home, for example. They will have better educated parents who will be able to put more into the children, and will tend to be pushy parents, pushier, looking for the very best for their children. Those from the less privileged, the poorer backgrounds, they'll not have the resources to hand. They'll have other worries on their hands. The children may not have sort of dedicated, quiet places where they can study. The parents themselves will tend not to be so well educated, unable to help the child or push the child as much as they possibly can. This is unsurprising. This is life. This is how things are. Now, it's one of the things where I actually agree with Sturgeon, her wanting to close the gap. And what's more important, what she said at the time, again, I agree with. She said we must close the gap by raising standards at the bottom, not dropping standards at the top. There's no point closing the attainment gap if the ones at the bottom are still at the bottom and all you're doing is cutting the ankles off those who are wealthy to bring them down. You must bring those at the bottom up. And that's fine. That's absolutely fine. That's the correct way of doing it, unlike what Keir Starmer and his bunch of clowns are doing, which is to hack away at the top, at the better educated, richer classes, and bring them down to the worst case, bog standard comprehensive level, instead of bringing the comprehensives up, because that costs. So anyway, you have this willingness by well, no, you don't have this willingness. That's the wrong word. You have this utterance by Sturgeon that she says she wants to close the attainment gap. Noble. But what did she actually do about it? How much funds, for example, did she put in? None at all. Because although they say the words, they don't mean the words. The last thing the SNP want, of course, is an educated population. Educated children grow up to become educated adults, and educated adults ask very, very awkward questions of politicians. They don't like being held to account. However, in all this time, from 2016 to the 2026 date, because she said, I want to do this, I want to close this attainment gap in 1 decade, in 10 years. We're now 8 years in, so 80% of the way. How far have we got? Well, it's a massive leap. They've actually done very, very well. They've closed the attainment gap by 0.9%. Taking those figures and running forward with them, it will take about 113 years to close the attainment gap. That's on the general attainment, 113 years at the current rate. For numeracy in primary schools, the attainment gap has closed 0.4%, which, again, if you use that as the baseline and go forward, it'll take about 220 odd years to close the attainment gap. I mean, my God, by the time they actually close this attainment gap, we'll have passed beyond the heat death of the universe. This is how bad these people are. When it's perfectly clear and adequately obvious that really, despite them saying what they're saying, they don't really mean it. They don't want it. They haven't pumped any money in. And it's not as though they haven't got the money. We know they've got the money. They had £500 million to wank away on a ferry that's never going to sail. They spend millions a year sending Fat Angus first class all around the world, quaffing his champagne, eating his caviar and staying at the very best hotels on public expense. They've got all those pretendy embassies filled with all the relatives and friends of the SNP, all on very good salaries, living a very nice life all over the world and helping to give the illusion that Scotland is its own sovereign country, which of course it isn't. And none of them do any work because all the real work is done in the British embassy all around the world. And so it's the same everywhere. No matter where you look, it's waste after waste after waste. Millions of pounds on little brochures about independence that will never, ever happen. And so the children languish at the bottom of a failing education system. And we've seen the results on the international table. Scotland falling down so far. There are third world countries with better educational outcomes than what is achieved by the children of Scotland. And Jenny Gilruth sitting there, she's been in that job quite long enough now. She must have got to grips with it. She must know what the problems are. And yet she's done precisely the square root of bugger all to try and resolve the problem, to try and lift these education standards up. Everybody knows it's failing. You have, what's his name? Lib Dem, Willie Rennie. He's coming out. He's slating it off. He's saying it's shameful. He's saying that the SNP should hold their heads in shame. I'm talking about how Nicola Sturgeon promised all these wonderful things would happen, promised this vast uplift in educational standards, that the attainment gap would be closed by 2026. I mean, that deadline is approaching very, very quickly. But I think this train is definitely going to hit the buffers because they are still 10 generations, if it's 220 years, 10 generations of children away from hitting the target. It is pretty bad. And there goes the dog. Someone's at the door. Bear with me. Barnsley, shush. I'm going to have to go. These dogs, I'm going to have to go. Do apologise. We'll cut this one short because otherwise he will bark his head off. Shut up! Anyway, we'll leave that there. It's never going to happen. 10 generations of children, lives wasted, and I've got to go and answer the door. Bye.